Today's guest is Emily Lawler, the politics and government editor for the Detroit Free Press, who will break down what's in play in Michigan, a state that's on everyone's play card in the race for the presidency. We've all heard about the 7 wonders of the world. Well, Michigan is one of the 7 swing states that may change that world. From Ballard Studios in Washington, D.C., another special election episode of 13th and Park.
You and I can differ, but that doesn't mean you and I cannot be friends.
That often is missing in politics.
We went from North Korea to M&M. That's a lot, man.
Aliens could have invaded and nothing would surprise me at this point.
It's a nightmare.
Those are the facts.
We have to solve everything.
What's in this tea?
Emily, welcome to the show. In the elections, obviously, Michigan is one of the 7 key states. It is one of the blue wall states. And as you know, in 22, there was a very big role for Democrats in that state where they captured all the state offices. Are they trending more and more blue as you might consider that Florida, which is a swing state, is trending more and more red?
I don't think so, actually. I think that, Michigan for years was considered a solidly blue state, and that was borne out in at least our presidential results. But we sort of had this dichotomy on the national scene. People were like, oh, yeah, Michigan's a blue state. I was back here in Michigan covering a Republican governor, House, and Senate. So right. I've always sort of felt that push and pull. And there's always been a little bit of a difference between how people show up in midterms versus general elections. Our 2022 cycle was huge for Democrats. First of all, it was the first cycle where we redrew our House and Senate seats, our districts, with, for the first time, a nonpartisan board instead of that going through the legislative process. So that certainly helped. Gretchen Whitmer running 11 points ahead of her Republican challenger,
right.
And then abortion being on the ballot. I think that all 3 of those things sort of wrapped together to give us the first Democratic trifecta for House, Senate, and governor in 40 years in Michigan, which is huge.
Has that changed the trajectory of politics, that kind of more all Democrat cast?
Certainly like the first year that the Democrats were in control of those 3 legs of the stool, we saw them undo a number of big Republican policies. Michigan, I think, is one of the states to detransition from being a right-to-work state, right? So right. I do think that they made some really big gains and showed their base that they're a party who can get into office, govern, do what they say they're going to do.
You and the Detroit Free Press have launched into this Voter Voices project where you've chosen 8 counties to really do a deep dive on. And you've been in touch with voters in those counties. One that's not on your list, that's on other lists, is Oakland, which is, another huge prize. And I love the names you've given to some of these 8 counties: college towns, working class, grain America, middle suburb. Give us an example. Let's take Kent, which is one of the real swing areas. It's the Grand Rapids area. You call it urban suburb. Let's talk about what's going on in Kent and what are the people there and in some of these other swing counties telling you, Emily, about where they are or where they might be.
When you look at something like Kent, it's an area that has a big city, Grand Rapids, our biggest city on the west side of the state. We have this view of Kent as being a conservative area. It's gone for Gretchen Whitmer every time she's run. So I think it's sort of morphing into this really purple area, maybe a lean D area that I think, if I were Kamala Harris or Tim Walz, I'd be looking at that area and thinking there's votes to be picked up there, right? We haven't seen Kent County be particularly friendly to that brand of Republicanism, I guess I would say. Trump specifically hasn't played well. And even though they have these Republican roots, the people there are just kind of going in a different direction. And we've really seen the people representing those areas in the legislature become more moderate as their constituencies do.
So what's top of mind right now as you're picking this up on the street? What issues are driving political fate there?
I will say, so we've been out in these 8 counties since February, I think. And it's really kind of morphed. We were hearing a lot about inflation, especially when Biden was top of ticket. Right. I think people really were eager to hold him accountable for that. They're really feeling it in the pocketbook. I do think that we're hearing a little bit less about that, although certainly still important to people. I think we're hearing more about different cost categories. People are concerned about the cost of housing and childcare. One thing that's been really consistent is the border. Michigan is a border state, but not that border.
Right.
And I think that people are really concerned about the southern border. And that's something that we've sort of continued to hear as we've talked to people in these counties.
As an outsider, when you think of Michigan, you think about the auto industry. It seems that President Trump's message is revitalizing the auto industry in and beyond Michigan. And from Kamala Harris, her big push is talking about being a part of the biggest pro-union administration in history. How did those two pitches play to blue-collar workers in the auto industry? And where's the union rank and file in this election?
It's hard to tell. I would say that the UAW's power in the state like Michigan is not just that it has a number of active workers at plants. It's that it has this huge retiree network and retirees vote, right? So I think that they're making some efforts to activate that base, obviously for Kamala Harris. That's who they're backing in the election. We have seen people on both sides of the aisle, certainly who are in the union. I think that that's sort of an active discussion among union members. You know, I don't think I would add up the number of union represented people and retirees in Michigan and say that's the number of votes for Harris. Certainly, we've seen some activism from conservative union members in recent years. So I do think that it's a little bit more of a mixed picture than people might naturally assume.
But it's the same kind of, and Trump in 2016 came into Michigan with kind of a similar pitch, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think that the issue kind of wedging between people right now is the EV transition too. You know, Trump has come in and said there's an electric vehicle mandate, which isn't strictly true, but the standards are written to certainly incentivize and encourage electric vehicle production. Michigan's been making a huge effort to be on the forefront of, you know, things like battery plants, supplemental things that will go into those electric vehicles. At the same time, Michigan's kind of a hard state for EV adoption. You know, I think about the perfect case for an electric vehicle, and it might be more like a suburban setting where you're maybe commuting 20 miles to work and 20 miles back. But, you know, I think about people in downtown Detroit with street parking only where they can't install those chargers. I think about people in rural Michigan living an hour or 2 hours away from the major city. People have been pretty hesitant to adopt that, and just, you know, layered on top of the fact that vehicles generally have gotten so expensive that there's an affordability issue in the state that put the world on wheels here.
But is there concern among auto industry workers that the industry may be in for tougher sledding ahead? And if so, wouldn't that be something that would open it up to, say, a Donald Trump going at doing things differently than what's happened over the last couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Biden-Harris administration has really made this push, this investment toward electric vehicles as a new way to reinvigorate the auto industry, as a way to like remain sort of on that frontier. And I think that Trump's vision, when he comes and says EVs aren't for everybody, his vision seems to bring Michigan's auto industry, as we experienced it in the past, back to the forefront. I just don't know how possible that is. I don't know how possible workers think that is. We all, every Michigander has stories in their family of people who worked on the line, who took a ton of pride in the product that they produced, who will only buy this brand of car for the rest of their lives, and all of their descendants feel the same way. Like, this is a big cultural point in Michigan. Certainly, there's a lot of nostalgia for him to tap into there.
Let's go half a world away and then bring it back to Michigan. Obviously, there's a lot of concern about what's going on in the Middle East, especially the involvement now of Iran much more directly. There are more Arab Americans in the state of Michigan than anywhere else in the country. What is the impact of the conflagration in the Middle East potentially on the Arab American vote in Michigan, and how significant is that vote to the bottom line of who's going to come home with all the laurels?
The census on this is really tricky, but, you know, the numbers we've seen are roughly 300,000 people who might fall into that MENA category. But again, the way they've measured that has changed over the years, so it's hard to measure to some extent. But I wouldn't assume that those are 300,000 plus Democratic votes that are now in limbo. You know, in 2022, that cycle, we saw some members of the Arab American or Muslim communities campaigning with Tudor Dixon for book bans. There's some natural conservatism that runs through those communities.
Are both campaigns going after that block of voters pretty aggressively?
Yes and no. I think both campaigns have engaged with that block on some level, but there's this sort of push and pull, I think, because there's a big Jewish community also here in Oakland County. And I do think that it's hard for world leaders to really come here and make a strong case for one side or the other when so many people have personal connections. People are losing family members in the Gaza Strip. The uncommitted movement, which started here in Michigan, decided not to endorse Kamala Harris. I talked to one Democratic candidate in one of our congressional districts who said he wasn't hearing a lot about Gaza. That would sort of surprise me. It's just a complicated conversation, and it's almost too complicated of a conversation for any one candidate to really dominate in a way that I think would make a big difference on the vote.
So let's go to another demographic, African Americans. There's been an assumption in this race that Kamala Harris is energizing the African American base and that that's going to be a big part of any winning coalition she would have in and beyond Michigan. The Trump team counters that they think they're doing very well versus historical standards, especially among Black men. How do you see it?
Yeah. So we've actually done some polling, and Kamala Harris does poll really well among Black Michiganders. So I do think there's a little bit of energization that has happened. But, really, too, the suburbs have gotten incredibly diverse. There are a ton of Black families who are living in our suburbs up into Oakland County, up into Macomb County, and they're moving into places that are really more swing areas. So I think that, if Black voters looking to support Kamala Harris come out in full force, they're certainly looking at swinging some suburban votes as well.
Apart from the presidential race, any point of view on the U.S. Senate race? So obviously control of the Senate's a big deal. Lisa Slotkin and Mike Rogers are going head to head. Slotkin seems to have maintained a narrow but consistent edge over Rogers up to this point. Do you think that's still, I think the Cook Political Report says it's a toss-up. Do you think this thing is also coming in for a hot landing?
Yes. One of those things I'm hoping doesn't keep me up for days after the election.
Right.
I will say Alyssa Slotkin, she's been a really strong campaigner, a really strong candidate with a lot of crossover appeal. And I think that's really helped her in Michigan. And, Mike Rogers has been in Congress. He's certainly a strong candidate. He's got a lot of establishment support to tap into. Mm-hmm. He's coming back to a little bit of a different Republican Party than he once represented in the state of Michigan. I think that comes with some logistical challenges. And I think that he will be getting a lot of support from outside groups who look at this as one of the biggest opportunities to take a seat in the U.S. Senate. It would be a historical anomaly for a Republican to get a U.S. Senate seat in Michigan. But like I say, we're purpler and purpler. I don't think it's safe to count us as a Democratic seat like you might have 10 or 15 or 20 years ago.
Of all the counties in Michigan, of all the counties in the country that are swinging, give us one and the reason why maybe that county, if it's a razor-thin election, that county may be the one that tips the scales.
So I'm going to give you one we haven't talked about yet, and it's Saginaw County. So this is the seat for that 8th congressional district, represented for 40 years by a Kildee, most recently Dan Kildee, a Democrat who's been very active in the congressional delegation, is not running for re-election. It's an open seat. And I think it's an open question as to how red that area has gotten. Trump has been going to Saginaw. Biden stopped by Saginaw when he was still on the ticket. But, I think both campaigns realized that that's an area that they could win or lose on a really slim margin.
Can we expect a fast count? Meaning, is Michigan, do you think, going to get their numbers in relatively orderly fashion? Or is this going to be like Georgia, Arizona, and others where it might be a while?
Michigan has a really dispersed system. We have hundreds of local clerks processing hundreds of different results. And then some of them have stopped electronically transmitting results and are driving them to the county. So I would say that you maybe want to take a nap at least, at 2 a.m., just take a little nap, wake up, and then maybe you'll wake up to the news. As
much as Michigan is an incredibly attractive place for so many things, what's coming your way is an international focus on how the people in that state decide what to do and how to do it in a race that may determine all sorts of fates, including our own. Thank you very much for joining us. I think your project, by the way, the Voices Project, is brilliant. And we look forward to seeing where the tipping point will be in a place you know so well.
Thanks for having me. And please do watch the Lions or come to Michigan for More Than Politics. It's a great time of year. We've got the leaves turning.
You can count on it. Take care, Emily.